Tonight we journey back to April 1927 to a shipyard in Lorain, Ohio, where workers were assembling what would become the largest ship on the Great Lakes, a vessel that would hold that distinction for decades, that would carry limestone and coal and iron ore across these inland seas for 31 years, before a November storm would tear her apart, taking 33 of her 35 crew members with her, leaving only 2 survivors to tell a story of structural failure so catastrophic that it would change how ships were built on the Great Lakes forever. We return to the Carl D. Bradley to examine whether this massive freighter was doomed from the moment her keel was laid, whether the very design and construction that made her the largest ship on the lakes also contained the seeds of her destruction, whether the men who sailed aboard her for 3 decades were always traveling in a vessel that was slowly, invisibly failing beneath their feet. The question that haunts maritime historians and engineers even now, more than 6 decades after she broke apart on Lake Michigan, is whether the Bradley was built to fail, whether compromises made in her design to maximize cargo capacity created fundamental weaknesses that would eventually prove catastrophic, whether the economics of shipping led to construction decisions that sacrifice long-term structural integrity for short-term profit and efficiency. The answer is not simple, not clear-cut, not something that can be reduced to yes or no, but rather exists in the complicated space where engineering meets economics, where design theory confronts real-world stresses, where decisions that seemed reasonable at the time reveal themselves as fatal only after disaster has already occurred. The American Shipbuilding Company laid the Bradley's keel in the spring of 1927, during an era when the Great Lakes shipping industry was expanding rapidly, when demand for iron ore and limestone and coal seemed endless, when bigger ships meant more cargo per voyage, meant greater profits for companies that could afford to build them. The Bradley was designed to be enormous by the standards of the day, 639 feet long from bow to stern, 65 feet across her beam, capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo in her holds, dwarfing most other vessels on the lakes, representing a leap forward in scale that reflected the ambition and confidence of American industry in the late 1920s, before the Depression would shatter that confidence, before the world would learn that bigger is not always better, that growth cannot continue forever, that limits exist even when we pretend they do not. She was a self-unloader, equipped with a conveyor system that could empty her cargo holds without requiring dock equipment, an innovation that made her more versatile and valuable, that allowed her to serve ports that lacked the cranes and equipment needed to unload conventional freighters, that gave her competitive advantages in the marketplace, where shipping companies competed for contracts and routes. The self-unloading equipment added weight high in the ship's structure, changing the center of gravity, creating stresses that designers had to account for, that required careful engineering to ensure the vessel remained stable and safe. that introduced complexities into calculations that were still more art than science in 1927. Before computer modeling, before sophisticated stress analysis, before the tools that modern engineers take for granted existed even in crude form, the hull was constructed of riveted steel plates, the standard technique of the era. Thousands upon thousands of rivets driven by men with hammers and pneumatic guns, creating joints that held the plates together, that distributed stresses across the structure, that were supposed to make the hull strong enough to withstand the forces that Great Lakes shipping would impose, the loading and unloading cycles, the waves and storms, the decades of service that owners expected from their vessels. Riveting was tried and tested technology, had been used in ship construction for generations, had built vessels that sailed successfully for years, that demonstrated the technique's viability and reliability. But riveting also had limitations, created stress concentrations at each rivet hole, introduced thousands of potential failure points into the structure, relied on the skill of individual workers to ensure each connection was properly made, each rivet properly driven, each joint properly sealed against water intrusion that could cause corrosion over time. The Bradley's hull was designed with a flat bottom rather than the more traditional curved design, a choice made to maximize cargo capacity, to allow the holds to be rectangular and efficient, to squeeze every possible ton of carrying capacity from the vessel's dimensions. This flat bottom design made economic sense, made the ship more profitable per voyage, made her more attractive to the company that would operate her and the customers who would hire her to carry their cargo. But the flat bottom also created different stress patterns than curved hulls, concentrated forces in ways that were not fully understood at the time, introduced structural characteristics that would become more problematic as the ship aged, as metal fatigued, as the cumulative effect of thousands of loading cycles took their toll on steel that was designed to flex, but not designed to flex forever. Not designed to withstand 3 decades of stresses that varied with every voyage, every storm, every cargo load. She was launched on a cold day in early 1927, sliding into the Black River with the ceremony and celebration that accompanied all ship launches, champagne breaking against her bow, workers and company officials and local dignitaries watching as this massive vessel entered the water for the first time, as she transitioned from construction project to functional ship, as she began her journey from brand new to aging to ultimately lost. The people who built her were proud of their work, proud of the size and capability they had created, proud to have constructed the largest ship on the Great Lakes, a vessel that would carry the Bradley name across these waters for decades, that would become familiar to those who watched ship traffic, that would serve the limestone trade with distinction and reliability for longer than most ships remained in service. For 31 years, The Carl D. Bradley carried cargo across the Great Lakes, primarily limestone from the quarries near Rogers City, Michigan, to the steel mills and construction sites around the lakes that consumed this essential material in vast quantities. She made voyage after voyage, season after season, loading at the quarry docks where conveyors poured limestone into her holds until she sat low in the water, heavy with cargo, then sailing to her destination to unload with her built-in conveyor system, then returning empty to load again, the cycle repeating hundreds of times over those 3 decades, each cycle stressing the hull, flexing the steel, working the rivets, gradually wearing away at the structure in ways too small to notice, voyage by voyage, but cumulative, over years, over decades, over the thousands of flexing cycles that a ship endures during a long career. The crews who sailed aboard her knew her intimately, knew her sounds and movements, knew how she handled in different conditions, knew the vibrations that meant machinery was running properly, and the different vibrations that meant something needed attention. They knew where she leaked slightly in heavy weather, where certain cargo holds were more prone to condensation, where the deck was wearing thin from foot traffic and needed watching. They knew her personality, the way all sailors know their ships as individuals rather than merely as machines, attributing character and temperament and mood to vessels that were nothing more than steel and machinery, but that seemed to have preferences and quirks and behaviors that made them feel alive, feel like entities rather than objects. But did they know she was failing? Did they notice the subtle signs that the structure was gradually weakening, that the rivets were working loose, that stress cracks were forming in places where visual inspection could not detect them, that the flat bottom design was creating metal fatigue that accumulated silently and invisibly, waiting for the right combination of stress and weather and loading condition to trigger catastrophic failure. Some crew members later reported having uneasy feelings about the ship, sensing something not quite right, noticing flexing and movement that seemed more pronounced than it should be, hearing sounds that suggested structural strain. But these observations were subjective, were difficult to quantify, were easy to dismiss as the normal concerns of sailors who always worried about their vessels because worrying was part of the job, was how they stayed alert to actual problems. Even if it meant false alarms, outnumbered real dangers by large margins. The Bradley underwent regular inspections as required by maritime regulations, surveys conducted by Coast Guard officials, and insurance company representatives who examined the hull and machinery, who looked for obvious signs of deterioration or damage, who certified that the vessel remained seaworthy and safe to operate. These inspections were thorough by the standards of the era, but those standards were limited by the technology and understanding available, could not detect internal corrosion or metal fatigue, could not measure stress patterns or predict failure points could only identify problems that were already visible, already manifesting as obvious damage rather than hidden weakness. The Bradley passed these inspections year after year, received certifications that allowed her to continue sailing, that assured her owners and crews that she remained a safe vessel, that gave no warning of the structural problems that were developing beneath surfaces that looked solid, behind plates that seemed intact, in riveted joints that appeared sound, but were slowly failing in ways that instruments of the time could not measure. By the 1950s, the shipping industry was beginning to understand that the early self-unloading vessels, like the Bradley, had structural characteristics that made them prone to certain kinds of failure, that the combination of flat bottoms, self-unloading equipment adding weight high in the structure, and the stresses of Great Lakes service created conditions where metal fatigue could become critical, where hulls could develop weaknesses that were difficult to detect, but potentially catastrophic if they progressed far enough. Some older vessels were being retired or extensively rebuilt to address these concerns, reinforced with additional structural members, strengthened in areas where experience had shown weakness was likely to develop, modified to extend their service lives and improve their safety margins. The Bradley was not retired and was not extensively rebuilt, continued sailing with only routine maintenance and repairs, continued carrying her cargoes across the lakes as she had for decades, continued being a profitable asset for the company that owned her, continued being a workplace for the men who crewed her. The decision to keep her in service without major structural work was not obviously negligent at the time, not clearly reckless, not the kind of choice that immediately appears dangerous or irresponsible. She was passing her inspections, was functioning adequately, was not showing obvious signs of being unsafe, was still capable of carrying cargo and completing voyages, was still earning money for her owners and wages for her crew. But in retrospect, after the disaster, the decision to continue operating her without major structural reinforcement would be questioned, analyzed, debated, held up as example of how economic considerations can override safety concerns, how vessels can continue sailing beyond the point where they should be retired, how the absence of obvious failure can mask the presence of developing catastrophe. November 1958 found the Carl D. Bradley at the end of another shipping season, making what would be one of her final voyages before winter ice closed the upper lakes, before she would be laid up for the winter months when Great Lakes shipping halted and crews found other work or collected unemployment until spring thaw allowed navigation to resume. She had loaded limestone at Rogers City, her holds filled with the gray stone that was her usual cargo, the weight settling her deep in the water, as it had thousands of times before, as it would never do again. This final loading that would still be in her holds when she went to the bottom of Lake Michigan, when her career ended, not with retirement, but with catastrophic structural failure. 35 men sailed aboard her on that November voyage, a typical crew for a vessel of her size. Men ranging from teenagers on their first seasons to veterans with decades of Great Lakes experience, men from Rogers City and other towns around the lakes, men doing a job they knew well, expecting a routine voyage, expecting to complete this trip and perhaps one or two more before the season ended, before they went home to families and winter employment and the anticipation of returning to the water in spring. They could not know that 33 of them would be dead within days, that only 2 would survive to tell what happened, that this voyage that seemed so ordinary, so routine, so unremarkable would become one of the most studied disasters in Great Lakes maritime history. The weather forecast spoke of a storm developing, but this was November on Lake Michigan, and storms were expected, were part of the job, were something that Great Lakes sailors dealt with as routine occupational challenges, navigating through them when necessary, waiting them out in port when prudence demanded, making judgments based on experience and the specific characteristics of each storm, each vessel, each cargo and route. Captain Roland Bryan, who commanded the Bradley on this voyage, reviewed the forecast and decided to sail, a decision that was his to make as master of the vessel, that reflected his assessment of the conditions and his confidence in his ship and his crew. That was the same decision that hundreds of captains had made thousands of times before when facing similar circumstances, that usually ended with ships reaching their destination safely, delivering their cargoes, completing their voyages without incident or drama. Through November 17th and into November 18th, the Bradley made her way across Lake Michigan, pushing through seas that were building as the storm intensified, through winds that strengthened hour by hour, through conditions that gradually deteriorated from uncomfortable to challenging to dangerous. Though danger is relative, and what seems dangerous to observers on shore often seems merely difficult to sailors accustomed to heavy weather, accustomed to ships moving in ways that would terrify landsmen, accustomed to waves and wind, and the constant motion that is the environment where they work, where they have trained themselves to function, where they have learned to maintain their balance and their focus and their effectiveness, even when the vessel is pitching and rolling in ways that make every movement an exercise in timing and coordination. By late afternoon on November 18th, the storm had reached gale force, winds howling across Lake Michigan's surface, waves building to heights that made the Bradley labor heavily, that sent solid water across her deck, that created conditions where the crew stayed below when possible, where movement on deck was dangerous and limited to essential tasks that could not be postponed, where the ship herself became the only safe space, the steel hull and superstructure providing shelter from wind and water that would kill exposed humans within minutes, that reduced the outside world to a hostile environment where survival required protection, required being inside, required trusting that the ship would continue to float, continue to maintain her integrity, continue to provide the sanctuary that separated life from death in the middle of Lake Michigan in a November storm. Around 5 p.m., the Bradley began to break apart. The exact moment of initial failure is difficult to pinpoint, may have been preceded by smaller cracks and warnings. that crew members noticed, or perhaps did not notice, may have been sudden, or may have been the culmination of damage that had been progressing for minutes or hours. Stress cracks propagating through metal that was already weakened by 3 decades of fatigue, that had been flexing and working in the storm all day, that finally reached the point where material could no longer withstand the forces being applied, where structural integrity catastrophically failed, where the hull that had held together through thousands of voyages and countless storms finally gave way, finally broke, finally proved unable to continue, resisting the combination of age and design limitations and the particular stresses that this particular storm on this particular day was imposing. The failure was not subtle, not gradual, not the kind of thing where crew members would have time to react and respond and organize evacuation. The Bradley broke in two, her hull fracturing somewhere near midships, the crack propagating through steel and rivets, with the sound that survivors later described as like an explosion, like thunder, like nothing they had ever heard before, a sound that meant the fundamental structure that held the ship together was failing, that the barrier between floating and sinking was breaching, that the crisis every sailor fears but hopes never to experience was upon them, without warning, without preparation, without any of the gradual escalation that might have allowed for responses that could have saved more lives. The 2 sections of the ship remained connected briefly by the deck and the self-unloading machinery that ran the length of the vessel, creating a horrible hybrid where the ship was both intact and broken, both one vessel and 2 pieces, held together by components that were never designed to bear the structural loads that the hull normally carried, that were being torn apart by forces that exceeded anything they were built to withstand. The Bradley twisted in the seas, the bow and stern sections moving independently, connected by equipment that was failing, that was tearing loose, that was adding to the catastrophe, even as it briefly prevented complete separation, creating a situation where crew members trying to escape or survive had to navigate a ship that was no longer behaving as a ship, that had become something else, something that had no analog in their training or experience, that required improvisation in circumstances where panic and confusion and the sheer physical violence of structure failing made clear thinking nearly impossible. The stern section, where most of the crew quarters and the pilot house were located, sank quickly once the section separated completely, the broken end flooding immediately, the weight of water rushing in, pulling that end down, the stern lifting briefly into the air before the entire section plunged beneath the surface, taking most of the crew with it. Men who were in their bunks or in the engine room or in the pilot house when the ship broke, who had perhaps seconds of warning, perhaps none, who found themselves suddenly in water that was cold enough to kill in minutes, even if they avoided drowning, who struggled in darkness and confusion, and the catastrophic violence of a large vessel breaking apart and sinking, who died trapped inside or died in the water shortly after escaping, hypothermia shutting down their bodies, stopping their hearts, ending their lives even as they struggled to survive. The bow section remained afloat longer. Buoyancy in the undamaged forward portion, keeping it on the surface for hours, giving the crew members who had been forward some chance of survival, some opportunity to abandon ship in a more controlled way than those in the stern had experienced. 4 men managed to get into a life raft, launching it from the bow section, getting themselves into the fragile rubber craft that represented their only hope of surviving until rescue could arrive. Their only protection against water that would kill them in minutes if they were immersed. Their only chance at life if they could just hold on, just endure, just survive the cold and the waves and the waiting until help came. Gary Strelecki and Frank Mays were the two who would survive, who would endure 4 hours in the life raft, watching the bow section of the Bradley finally sink beneath the surface, watching their 2 raft mates die of hypothermia, despite being out of the water, despite doing everything they could to stay alive, despite the raft working as designed, protecting them from immersion but unable to protect them from cold that penetrated their wet clothing, that drew heat from their bodies faster than their metabolism could replace it, that shut down extremities first and then worked inward, claiming fingers and toes and hands and feet, then arms and legs, then core functions, then consciousness, then life itself, turning living men into bodies, into cargo that Strelecki and Mays had to share the raft with, had to huddle against for whatever warmth remained in flesh that was cooling toward the same temperature as the water that surrounded them. Rescue came eventually. Coast Guard vessels, alerted by the Bradley's distress signals, finding the life raft, finding 2 survivors and 2 bodies, finding the only men who would survive from a crew of 35, finding the witnesses who could tell what happened, who could describe the breaking apart, who could provide the testimony that investigations would need to understand how and why the Carl D. Bradley had failed so catastrophically, had killed so many, had gone from functioning vessel to wreck in minutes, had demonstrated whatever flaws or weaknesses or age-related deterioration had been developing silently for years or decades, waiting for the right combination of conditions to trigger failure. The investigation that followed was exhaustive, examining every aspect of the Bradley's design and construction and maintenance history, analyzing the wreckage that divers located on the lake bottom, interviewing the survivors and other sailors who had served aboard the Bradley over the years, consulting with naval architects and metallurgists and engineers, trying to understand not just what had happened, but why, trying to determine whether this disaster was preventable, whether it revealed systematic problems with Great Lakes ship design and operation, whether the Bradley was unique or whether other vessels might be vulnerable to similar failures, whether the entire fleet needed to be re-examined and potentially rebuilt or retired to prevent future disasters. The investigation found that the Bradley had broken due to structural failure, that metal fatigue and the stresses imposed by the storm had exceeded the hull's capacity to remain intact, that the combination of the ship's age and her design characteristics and the particular conditions of that November evening had created the circumstances for catastrophic failure. But the investigation also found that the Bradley had passed all required inspections, that she had been certified as seaworthy, that her owners and operators had not violated regulations or ignored obvious warning signs, that by the standards and practices of the time, they had maintained and operated her appropriately, that the disaster was not the result of clear negligence or recklessness, but rather revealed limitations in understanding of how ships age and fail, revealed gaps in inspection capabilities, revealed that vessels could appear sound while actually being dangerously weakened in ways that available technology could not detect. The question of whether the Bradley was built to fail, whether her design contained inherent weaknesses that made disaster inevitable eventually, does not have a simple answer. She was not deliberately built badly, was not the product of incompetence or corruption or knowing disregard for safety. She was built according to the engineering understanding and construction practices of 1927, using techniques that were standard for the era, incorporating design choices that made sense given the economics and operational requirements of Great Lakes shipping, reflecting the knowledge and capabilities that existed at that time before decades of additional experience would reveal limitations and problems that were not apparent when the ship was new. But the design choices that made the Bradley successful as a cargo carrier, that made her profitable and efficient and capable of carrying more cargo than smaller vessels, also created structural characteristics that made her vulnerable to metal fatigue in ways that were not fully understood when she was built, that only became apparent over decades of service, that only revealed themselves as problematic when the accumulated damage from years of loading cycles and storm stresses reached critical levels. The flat bottom that maximized cargo capacity also created stress concentrations. The self-unloading equipment that made her versatile also added weight high in the structure and introduced complexity. The riveted construction that was standard practice also created thousands of potential failure points. None of these factors alone was necessarily fatal, but in combination, over 31 years, they created conditions where catastrophic failure became possible, became likely, became inevitable, given enough time and the right storm. Modern naval architecture has learned from the Bradley and other disasters, has developed better understanding of metal fatigue and structural loads, has created inspection techniques that can detect hidden damage, has established more conservative safety margins and more rigorous maintenance requirements, has produced ships that are stronger and safer and less prone to the kind of catastrophic failure that claimed the Bradley. The lessons were bought with the lives of 33 men, with the grief of families who lost fathers and sons and brothers, with the trauma of 2 survivors who lived, but who carried the memories of that night for the rest of their lives, who could never entirely escape the sound of the ship breaking apart, the sight of the bow section sinking, the feeling of cold that penetrated everything, the knowledge that they survived only by luck and endurance, while their shipmates died. Rogers City, Michigan, where most of the crew lived, where the Bradley had been a familiar presence for decades, where families had depended on wages from Great Lakes shipping for generations, was devastated by the loss. The town was small enough that nearly everyone knew someone who had died, that the disaster touched virtually every family either directly or through friends and neighbors, that the collective grief was overwhelming, that the memorial service drew thousands of people trying to process loss on a scale that small communities are not equipped to handle, that should not have to handle, that revealed the human cost of maritime commerce in ways that statistics and abstract discussions of ship design and metal fatigue can never convey. 23 of the dead were from Rogers City, 23 men who would never come home, whose bodies in most cases were never recovered, who remained with the wreck on the lake bottom, or were scattered by currents across Lake Michigan's floor, who were memorialized without funerals, honored without burial, mourned without the rituals that help survivors process loss and begin healing. The town erected memorials, held annual services, kept the memory of the Bradley and her crew alive year after year, decade after decade, ensuring that the men who died would not be forgotten, that their sacrifice, because it was sacrifice, even if unintended, even if merely the price of employment rather than deliberate heroism, would be remembered and honored and used as a reminder of the costs that commerce sometimes imposes, that economic activity sometimes extracts in blood and loss and grief. The wreck of the Carl D. Bradley remains on the bottom of Lake Michigan, lying in several hundred feet of water, too deep for casual diving, protected by depth and cold, and the regulations that prohibit disturbing shipwrecks that are also graves that contain human remains, that are entitled to respect and preservation rather than exploitation and souvenir hunting. The wreck is monitored, occasionally documented by authorized expeditions that use remote vehicles and cameras to examine the structure, to study how the break occurred, to verify theories about the failure sequence, to add to the body of knowledge that helps prevent future disasters, that converts tragedy into lessons, that attempts to extract some positive outcome from events that were purely negative for those who experienced them. The 2 survivors, Gary Strelecki and Frank Mays, lived with their survival in different ways, both grateful to be alive, but both also burdened by survivors' guilt, by the knowledge that they had lived while 33 others died, by the memories of that night that never entirely faded, that intruded into dreams and quiet moments, that could be triggered by sounds or temperatures or news of other maritime disasters that made them part of a community they had not chosen to join, the community of those who have survived catastrophe, who have witnessed death on a scale that most people never experience, who know things about human fragility and random chance and the thin line between life and death that cannot be explained to those who have not experienced similar trauma. They spoke publicly about the disaster when asked, participated in documentaries and memorial services, helped investigators understand what had happened, provided the testimony that gave the disaster a human voice, that made it more than abstract analysis of structural failure. But they also struggled with their memories, with the weight of being the only ones who could tell the story from inside the experience, who carried knowledge that died with them, because experience cannot be fully transmitted, because there is always a gap between telling and understanding, because those who were not there cannot completely grasp what those hours in the life raft were like, what watching shipmates die felt like, what the cold and fear and exhaustion and eventual rescue meant to men who had been certain they would die, who had made peace with death and then had to unmake that peace, had to return to life, had to continue living with memories that they could neither forget nor fully communicate. The question of whether the Carl D. Bradley was built to fail invites us to consider larger questions about industrial capitalism, about the relationship between profit and safety, about how societies decide what risks are acceptable and who bears those risks, about whether we value human life sufficiently when we make decisions about engineering and maintenance and operation of equipment that employs people in dangerous environments. The Bradley was not built to fail in any intentional sense, but she was built within a system that prioritized cargo capacity and operating efficiency, that made design choices based on economic optimization, that accepted certain risks as inherent in maritime commerce, that did not anticipate or prepare for the ways that those design choices would manifest as weaknesses over decades of service. The men who died aboard the Bradley were not heroes in the traditional sense, were not engaged in rescue missions or military operations, were not deliberately risking their lives for causes larger than themselves. They were working men doing a job, earning wages, supporting families, engaged in the ordinary business of industrial commerce. But their deaths were no less tragic for being prosaic, were no less losses for being occupational rather than heroic, were no less worthy of remembrance and honor for occurring in the context of economic activity rather than grand historical events. They went to work and did not come home. And that is tragedy enough, is loss enough, is reason enough to remember them and to ask whether their deaths could have been prevented, whether the system that employed them valued their lives sufficiently, whether the ship they sailed was adequately designed and maintained, whether we owe them more than memory, owe them lessons learned and changes implemented and commitment to ensuring that future workers are not subjected to similar risks. The shipping industry changed after the Bradley, implementing new regulations and inspection procedures, requiring structural modifications to older vessels, establishing more conservative operational guidelines for storms and heavy weather, creating systems intended to prevent similar disasters. These changes saved lives, prevented some future disasters, made Great Lakes shipping safer for the crews who continued working on these vessels, who still faced risks but faced them with better equipment and better oversight and better understanding of how ships age and fail. The changes were bought with the lives of the Bradley's crew, were extracted from tragedy, were the silver lining that we construct around catastrophe to make it mean something beyond pure loss, to salvage some positive outcome from events that those who experience them would gladly erase if they could, would trade all the lessons and improvements and enhanced safety for having their loved ones back, for undoing the disaster, for returning to a world where the Carl D. Bradley completed her voyage and her crew came home, and November 18th, 1958 was just another day rather than the day that changed everything. The families who lost husbands and fathers and sons struggled with absence that never completely healed, with grief that softened over years, but never entirely disappeared, with holidays and birthdays and ordinary days that were forever marked by who was not there, who should have been there, whose absence was present in every gathering, every celebration, every moment that should have included them but could not, that continued without them, because life continues, because survival requires moving forward, because grief cannot stop time, even when it feels like time should stop, like the world should acknowledge loss by pausing, by marking tragedy with something more than continued ordinary existence. The children who grew up without fathers carried their loss differently, some barely remembering the men who died when they were very young, knowing their fathers primarily through photographs and stories and the second-hand memories that families preserve and transmit that become the only connection to people who died before full relationships could form. Others were old enough to remember, to have formed bonds that death severed, to understand what they had lost, to grow up with absence that shaped their lives in ways both obvious and subtle, that influenced their choices and relationships and understanding of the world, that made them members of a community they had not chosen, the community of those who have lost parents to disaster, who know from childhood that terrible things can happen suddenly, that people leave for work and do not come home, that life contains risks that cannot be entirely controlled or prevented, that safety is always relative, and survival is partly luck, and tragedy is real and possible, and not something that only happens to others. The town of Rogers City rebuilt its life around the absence, around the memorial, around the annual services that marked the anniversary of the loss, creating rituals that helped process grief that was too large for individuals to carry alone, that required community support and shared mourning and collective memory to become survivable. The Bradley became part of the town's identity, a defining event that residents marked time by, that divided history into before and after, that created bonds, between those who lost loved ones, that made the town itself a kind of memorial, a place where the disaster was remembered not just annually, but constantly, not just in formal services, but in everyday conversation, in the knowledge that nearly every older resident had some connection to the tragedy, some personal story, some memory of where they were when they heard the news, what they felt, how they coped. The memorial stands in Rogers City still, listing the names of the dead, providing a physical location where families and friends and strangers can come to remember, to honor, to reflect on loss and resilience and the human capacity to continue despite tragedy that seems unsurvivable in the moment, but that survivors do survive, do learn to live with, do integrate into their lives and identities in ways that transform them, but do not destroy them, that make them different people than they would have been, but still people, still living, still capable of joy and meaning and connection, despite carrying losses that never completely heal. The Great Lakes continue their eternal cycles, freezing and thawing, calming and storming, hosting ships that carry cargo across their surfaces, just as the Bradley once did, just as ships have done for centuries, just as ships will continue doing as long as commerce requires raw materials to be transported efficiently. The lakes do not remember the Bradley, do not distinguish between the waters above her wreck and waters anywhere else, do not mark anniversaries or mourn losses or acknowledge in any way the human tragedies that have occurred within their depths. The lakes simply are, simply continue, simply cycle through seasons and years with the same indifference that all natural systems show toward human concerns, toward human life, toward human grief and loss and memory. But we remember those of us who learn these stories, who study this history, who try to understand what happened and why and what it means and whether it could happen again. We remember because memory is how we honor the dead, how we extract meaning from tragedy, how we connect past to present and attempt to ensure that lessons learned are not forgotten, that sacrifices made, even unwilling sacrifices, even sacrifices that were simply tragic deaths in the course of employment, contribute something to future safety, to future understanding, to future prevention of similar disasters. We remember because the alternative is allowing the past to vanish, allowing those who died to be forgotten, allowing their deaths to mean nothing beyond the immediate grief of those who knew them. And that seems like a second death, a second loss, an unnecessary additional tragedy that we can prevent through the simple act of remembering, of telling stories, of keeping alive the knowledge of what happened. The Carl D. Bradley was not built to fail in any intentional or deliberately negligent sense, but she was built within constraints and with compromises, and according to understanding that proved inadequate over decades of service, that did not account for how ships age and how metal fatigues and how forces accumulate over time. She was built as well as 1927 technology and knowledge allowed. But that was not well enough to survive 31 years of service without catastrophic failure. She was built for profit and efficiency, and those priorities, while not inherently wrong, created vulnerabilities that eventually proved fatal. She was built by men who did their best with what they knew, but what they knew was incomplete, was limited, was insufficient to prevent the disaster that their creation would eventually experience. And 33 men paid the price for those limitations, died because ship design was imperfect, because inspection technology was inadequate, because understanding of metal fatigue was incomplete, because the economic pressures of shipping created incentives to keep vessels in service, perhaps longer than was safe, because storms happen and structures fail, and sometimes all the contributing factors align in ways that transform a routine voyage into catastrophe. They died doing their jobs, trusting that the ship would hold together, trusting that the inspections meant something, trusting that someone else had ensured the vessel was safe, trusting because they had to trust, because maritime employment requires trusting your ship and your captain and the company that owns the vessel, because the alternative is not sailing at all, is not working, is not earning the wages that support families and pay mortgages and provide the income that employment represents. Their trust was betrayed not by deliberate negligence, but by the limitations of human understanding, by the gaps between what was known and what was true, by the inevitable imperfection of all human systems, all human knowledge, all human engineering. They deserved better, deserved a ship that would not break apart, deserved to complete their voyage and go home to their families, deserved to live long lives and retire peacefully and die in their beds decades later, rather than in Cold Lake, Michigan water in November 1958. They deserved better, and they did not get it. And that is tragedy, and that is loss, and that is what we remember when we remember the Carl D. Bradley and her crew. If you enjoyed learning about this hidden chapter of maritime history, you'll love the next video recommended on your screen, where we explore another fascinating true story designed to help you drift peacefully into sleep. Rest well tonight, wherever you are. The storms have passed. The ships that sail now sail safer for the lessons learned from those who came before. The night is calm, and you are safe in your bed, far from cold water and November storms, safe to dream, safe to sleep, safe to remember those who were not safe, who faced the end with whatever courage they could muster, who are gone now but not forgotten, who rest in deep water while you rest in warmth and comfort and peace. Good night.